Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to part 4 of chapter 13. We're going to talk about cranial nerves. We're going to discuss 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They originate from the brain, specifically usually the brain stem. So this is central nervous system, and they're going to innervate parts of the peripheral nervous system. We use Roman numerals according to their position, and the name of the nerve usually relates somehow to its function. So we're going to see cranial nerve number 2, and it's called optic nerve. So obviously it's going to have something to do with vision or sight. And we'll go through these. I would have just a minimal sentence about what each one does in terms of function. Nice figure from your book showing the actual location of the cranial nerves. If you were to look at an inferior view of the brain, we are not going to have to identify them. So we are not IDing cranial nerves on the brain. We need to go through this list of cranial nerves. We need to know name, we need to know number, and we need to know function. And then we'll talk about whether they're sensory or motor or both. First cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. You can see that it's going to carry information about olfaction or smell. It's located here in the superior portion of the nasal cavity. So basically, sensory information is being carried from the nasal cavity to the brain. Sensory only information. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve, obviously going to have something to do with vision. So this is a sensory only nerve, and it is carrying information to the brain about vision. So we're going to end up talking about the retina at some point, last chapter, and so images are going to be displayed on the retina, and that information is going to be carried to our visual cortex in our occipital lobe. Now we have cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor. I love the naming, right? Ocular, eye, motor, some sort of movement. So you'll see people say that this is mostly a motor nerve. It's going to control the muscles that move the eye. It's also going to change the pupil diameter. We're going to see other cranial nerves that move the eye, so sometimes you have to pick out the one item or the function that's a little bit different. So here we can see ocular motor nerve comes out and it innervates not only the eye muscles, but comes out to the iris and is going to have something to do with changing the pupil diameter. And the pupil is the opening of the eye. We now move to trochlear nerve. This is cranial nerve number 4. This is a motor nerve that controls the superior oblique. If you want to look in your textbook, there's also a nice kind of testing label down here. How would they test clinically whether this nerve was functioning properly or not? If you've ever had the doctor say follow the pen, right? They put the pen in front of you and they're like track it. That's the test for the trochlear nerve. So there's several of these. If you're interested in looking at them, you can. They're not required for this course. I need you to know name, number, and a brief sentence about function. Cranial nerve number 5 is the III Trigeminal. It is going to feed the maxilla, the mandible, and then parts of the face. So there's 3 kind of branches here. This is a mixed nerve. It is carrying sensory information as well as motor information. Sometimes people will use the word mixed, sometimes people will use the word both. And these are going to be involved in chewing. Your trigeminal nerve is also going to be involved if you have any kind of dental work. So if I needed to work on this tooth, I might give you Novocaine. That Novocaine can travel in this cranial nerve and it can make part of your face kind of droopy. So this trigeminal nerve kind of spreads out over the face. But if it has anything to do with chewing or with toothache, this is the cranial nerve that we're talking about. Cranial nerve number 6, abducens, is going to abduct the eye. You can see that it's a motor nerve that's going to innervate this lateral rectus muscle, straight muscle of the eye. Hopefully we're going to go back and review these, and we know that this is the 3rd cranial nerve that has to do with eye movement. So this should tell you how important vision is, right? If we have redundancy, if we have multiple ways to move the eye, that probably means that that function is really important. So I'd make sure that I could name all 3 cranial nerves that are responsible for eye movement. Next is cranial nerve number 7. This is your facial nerve. It is a mixed nerve, so it has both sensory and motor function. So the motor section is going to control the muscles for facial expression. And for sensory, we're going to send messages from the tongue about taste or texture to the brain. I want you to also see that this facial nerve is controlling release from the lacrimal gland, which would produce tears, also your parotid, which would produce saliva. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is a sensory nerve involved in hearing and equilibrium. So the vestibule has to do with equilibrium and the cochlea has to do with hearing. So this part here is the cochlea, and so we're sending messages about what we're hearing. And the vestibule here is responsible for equilibrium, so we're sending messages about our balance, and all of that converges onto one nerve as it enters the brain to deliver the sensory information. Cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal. This is glosso-tongue and pharyngeal pharynx. So this is another mixed nerve. So the sensory is going to report taste and touch to the brain. So this will be sensory. And then motor control of the pharynx muscles. I usually think of swallowing when I think of the pharynx. The clinical test for this is to open your mouth and say, ah, and they're looking in your mouth to look at the position of your soft palate and your pharynx. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. This is also called the wandering nerve. As you can see, it exits the brainstem and it's innervating the larynx, so it is going to have something to do with vocal projection. Comes down to the lungs, the heart, digestive organs. So many viscera are controlled by the vagus nerve, and it's the main source of parasympathetic output. And we don't understand what this is right now, but think of the vagus nerve as acting to lower your heart rate. So sympathetic would be speed up, parasympathetic would be slow down. So you can imagine if anything happens to the vagus nerve, now all of a sudden your heart is speeding up faster than it should. So it can cause some issues with cardiac function. On to cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. I wanted you to see the origin here. Part of the origin comes from the brain stem, and part of the origin comes from the spinal cord. So in the beginning I said something about rootlet origin. This is one cranial nerve that people will argue about, but it is technically a cranial nerve, just to give you some background in case you care. But you can see that this is a motor nerve that's going to control muscles of the neck like the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid, and also part of the pharynx. So something I do want to mention, just like we had several cranial nerves that control eyesight, several of them control the pharynx. So it's probably just as important to swallow food as it is to be able to see or track or hunt the food, right? This, usually when I think of cranial nerves, I think of kind of those primitive functions, you know, sight, smell, taste, swallowing, controlling your heart, your viscera for digestion, your lungs for breathing. This one is interesting because if you hear a really loud noise, you turn your head in the direction of that noise due to this cranial nerve. So that would probably be a good primitive function. If you hear a really loud noise, you better turn your head quickly and look, right? Last slide, cranial nerve number 12. Hypo is going to be under, and glossal is going to be tongue. So you can see this is a motor nerve that controls the tongue muscles. You can see it innervating both the tongue and the muscles underneath the tongue. Your tongue is responsible kind of for two functions here. One is swallowing. So in order for you to push food back into your pharynx, your tongue has to work to push the food to the back of the throat. Also for speech. So we know that to make certain letter sounds, you have to have control of the muscles of the tongue, and you have to position the tongue in certain places in the oral cavity. One way that we could test for this would be when they say stick out your tongue, and then they say move your tongue from one side to the other. If you had some sort of deficiency or defect in this cranial nerve number 12, you wouldn't be able to move the tongue to side exactly the same. A summary of what I would do if I was studying cranial nerves. I would list the number and make sure that you use the Roman numeral. And then I would give the name, olfactory nerve, and then I would list the function. So tell me this has something to do with smell, and then also tell me something about the type of information it's carrying, sensory only. Then we move to cranial nerve number 2. We know this is optic. What's the function? Vision. What type of information is it carrying? Sensory only. And then continue down the list with all 12 cranial nerves. If you can do this, you're prepared for the test.